The ruins of Chicago smelled like rust and old fire. Dina Kovacs had stopped noticing it years ago, the way you stop noticing the sound of your own heartbeat. It was just the air now. Charred concrete and oxidized rebar and something underneath all of it. Something biological. Something that didn't belong to any human chemistry. The faint sweet rot of alien nutrient slick that the Veth left on every surface they occupied. You could scrub a wall clean, and 2 weeks later the smell would be back. Seeping up from the foundations, from the ground itself, like the city's bones had been marinating in it since the contact war ended. She moved low, picking her way through a collapsed overpass, one hand on the pistol at her hip and one trailing along the broken concrete for balance. Behind her, Bray moved in near silence. That was one of the things the augments had given him, a lightness, almost delicate, that looked wrong on a man his size. He'd been large before the war. Now he was something else. Titanium-laced femurs, composite ceramic ribcage, eyes that saw in 8 spectrums and recorded everything at 40 frames per second. The Veth field surgeons who'd pieced him back together after the Pittsburgh engagement had done good work, technically, clinically, the way a watchmaker does good work. Not because they care about the watch, but because imprecision offends them. He was alive. She reminded herself of that when she looked at him and felt the small, cold distance the augments had carved between the man she remembered and the thing he'd become. He was alive and he was here, and that counted for more than she could put words to. 2 contacts, Sector 9, Bray said quietly, not into a radio. The Veth had frequency mapped the whole district, just into the air between them. Scout class, hovering. They haven't marked us yet. Dina pressed herself against a pillar and looked. The scout drones were small, black oblate things about the size of a basketball, riding on repulsor fields that made a sound like a dentist's drill heard through water. They moved in a slow figure-8 pattern over the rubble field below, sensor clusters rotating. Passive sweep, they weren't hunting, not yet. "Can you take them quiet?" she asked. A pause. She'd learned to read his pauses in the years since the augments. There were different kinds. This one meant he was running the calculation and didn't like the variables. "If the second one gets off a signal before I reach it, we have 40 seconds before a response unit arrives," he said. "This district, that's going to be Hammer class." "That's not what I asked." Another pause. Then, almost imperceptible, the sound of a mechanism cycling in his right arm. "Yes," he said. "I can take them quiet." He moved before she could say anything else, stepping out of cover in a fluid drift that turned into a run so fast it took her a moment to track. The first drone didn't react until he was already airborne, and then it was too late. His hand closed around it, and he came down hard with it against the rubble, and there was a muffled crunch and it went dark. He was already spinning toward the second, which had begun its alert rotation, and he caught it mid-turn and drove it into the ground, and held it there until the signal emitter that had started warming up went cold. 40 seconds that they hadn't needed. He stood up, brushed dust from his jacket like he'd just knocked over a glass, and looked back at her. She exhaled and came out of cover. They were in the district on orders from Harker, the thick-necked black market operator who ran the Survivor compound under the old merchandise mart. The man who owned their debt the way you own something you've already sold twice. 2 months ago, Bray had taken a Veth rail spike through the side during a convoy intercept. The Veth surgeons who'd originally built his augments were gone, dead or absorbed, and there were only 3 people in the ruins of Chicago who could interface with Veth-grade augmentation hardware. Harker controlled 2 of them. The repairs had cost a number that Dina tried not to think about and hadn't managed to stop thinking about since. So they worked for Harker. They ran his salvage routes. They cleared his problems. And someday, if the numbers ever came right, they'd finish paying the debt and move on toward the thing they'd been telling themselves was waiting for them in the Northwest. The rumored enclave, the place the survivors called Olympus. The city that wasn't supposed to exist anymore, but kept appearing in second-hand accounts from people who'd walked in from the coast. A real city. Walls and power and food, and something that might have once been called a future. Dina had been careful, over the years, not to want it too badly. Wanting things too badly in this world was a way of making sure you never got them. They found what they'd been sent to find. A Veth supply chat in the basement of what had been a parking structure. Standard resin canisters that Harker's people would crack open and repurpose as power cells. Bray marked the location on his internal map. They'd come back with a cart. Standard job. In and out. It was on the way back that they heard the girl. Not the girl, first. The sound of Veth combat class augments running hard. which had a specific frequency signature that Bray picked up 3 seconds before Dina heard anything. He stopped and held up a fist, and she stopped too, and they listened to the distant, rhythmic hammering of pursuit, and then the shorter, more human sound of someone running on 2 feet and breathing too hard to sustain it. One human, Bray said. 2 Veth-line pursuers. No, 1 Veth, 1 hybrid, moving fast. Hybrid, modified human, Veth chassis, human base. She thought about that. Collaborators got augments. Everybody knew that. She didn't dwell on it. Which way, he pointed. They moved. They found the girl in a drainage tunnel. Small, dark-haired, maybe 17, sitting with her back against the wall, and her knees drawn up, and her eyes very wide. Beside her, crouched in a defensive posture, was a man, big. Ex-military, by the way he held himself. He had augments too, but different from Bray's. Cleaner, somehow, more intentional, less like a repair job, and more like a design decision. His left eye was replaced with something that glowed a faint amber, and when he saw Dina come around the corner with her pistol up, he didn't flinch. He just looked at her with that amber eye and waited. Easy, Dina said. We're not a threat, the man said. The 2 things behind you beg to differ. They're not behind us anymore. We lost them 4 blocks back, he paused. Mostly. The girl was looking at Dina with an expression that Dina recognized. Not fear, exactly, but the particular wariness of someone who had learned that strangers were more dangerous than the dark. She had a small pack on her back, and her hands were clasped in her lap. And there was something deliberate about the way she was sitting, like she was being careful not to touch the walls. What are your names, Dina said. It wasn't really a question. Olsen, Shiman said. Where are you from? A beat, northwest. Dina looked at him for a long moment. Then she looked at Bray, who was scanning the tunnel entrance with his augmented eyes. He gave a small shake of his head. Nothing incoming. Yet, come on, she said. If we're going to have this conversation, we're going to have it somewhere that isn't a drainage pipe. They brought them back to the squat. A fortified apartment on the 14th floor of a building that still had most of its exterior walls, which was rare enough in this district to count as luxury. Harker's compound was 3 kilometers away, and they kept the squat as a midpoint, a place to decompress between jobs. Dina had hung a map of the city on the east wall and marked the dead zones in red. There was more red than not. Bray made something hot from dried rations while Olsen talked. He talked carefully, the way people talk when they're deciding in real time how much to say. Iris sat in the chair by the window and looked out at the broken skyline and said nothings. The story came out in pieces. They were from a coordination cell that operated out of the northwest. Olsen was careful not to call it Olympus, but that was clearly what he meant. A resistance network. Better resourced than anything Dina had encountered in the ruins, with the kind of technical capability that could build augments that didn't look like salvage. Their mission was a demolition run. There was something buried beneath the South District, something the Veth had left behind when they'd pulled back their main force it. Something that the Veth commanders currently operating in the city wanted to reclaim and reactivate. What kind of something, Dina said. Olsen looked at his hands. The kind that ends cities. She had heard of the deep-buried Veth infrastructure. Everyone had. In the abstract way you hear about things that you hope will stay abstract. When the Veth had occupied the major population centers during the Contact War, they hadn't just stationed troops. They'd seeded the ground, buried things. The accepted theory was that the buried systems were dormant, deactivated when the occupation collapsed, inert, waiting for a reclamation team that would never come. The accepted theory, Olsen was telling her, was wrong. There's a command in the Veth network, he said, a faction. They're calling themselves the New Order internally, but most of the resistance just calls them the Talos class. Their commander is a hybrid, human base, near total Veth augmentation, and somewhere along the line he lost whatever kept him connected to the human part of it. He's been running collection operations in occupied zones for 2 years. He's been looking for Iris. Dina looked at the girl. Iris had turned from the window and was looking back at her. Her eyes were unusual, pale with a faint luminescence that Dina had originally attributed to reflection. Now, looking at her directly, she wasn't so sure. Why her? Dina said. Her retinal pattern, Olsen said. She was designed, partly, by Olympus as a key. The buried system in the South District is activation locked. It requires a specific biometric input. The Veth built their security systems around a genetic signature that they thought was unique to their own command class. Olympus found a way to replicate it, to create a living key. Iris can open the lock, which means she can also close it. Permanently. Dina looked at Bray. He was eating his rations and giving nothing away, which meant he was thinking very hard. You want to use her to blow it up, Dina said. We want to use her to shut it down safely. The detonation protocol is built into the access system. Once she interfaces, she can trigger the self-destruct. The fortress goes up, the buried threat is neutralized, and we go home. And the Talos class commander wants to activate it instead. He wants to ride it. I've seen his communiques. He thinks he's going to rebuild civilization by force. He's going to point the thing at whatever's left and call it order. Olsen's jaw tightened. He's not wrong that it would work for a while. A long silence. Outside, wind moved through the broken upper floors of adjacent buildings and made a low, mournful note. Why are you telling us this, Dina said. Because we need help. Because the Talos class has people in the district and we don't know them from ground level and you clearly do. And because, Olsen hesitated. Because I heard your name, in the Northwest. You have a reputation. For what? For being stubborn enough to still be here, she almost laughed. Almost. The next morning, Harker's mechanic showed up unannounced. His name was Cass, and he was a small man with oil-stained hands, and a way of never quite meeting your eyes that Dina had always found unsettling. He said he needed to do a calibration check on Bray's augment systems. Routine maintenance, he said, standard interval. And Bray, who trusted Dina's instincts about people and had clocked the same unease about Cass from the beginning, submitted to it with visible reluctance. Dina watched Cass work. She watched his hands. She watched the way he moved around Bray's exposed access panel with a confidence that didn't match the stated purpose of a routine check. After Cass left, she sat down with Bray and made him run a full self-diagnostic. It took an hour. When it finished, he was very still for a long time. My output limiter has been adjusted, he said. 3 months ago, and again 6 weeks ago. I've been operating at 63% efficiency, and I didn't know it. Something cold moved through her. Harker, she said. Has to be. Cass works for him exclusively. She thought about the debt, the maintenance fees, the jobs that kept coming, and the number that never seemed to go down. She thought about how Harker had once said, in a casual way that she'd let herself interpret as humor, that good assets needed to be managed carefully. Can you remove the limiter yourself? Another pause then. Yes, I think I've been afraid to look closely enough. Look closely enough, she said. He did. It took another 20 minutes, and when he was done, he rolled his shoulders slowly. The way someone does when they've been sitting in a bad position for too long, and then rolled them again, and she watched his posture change in a way that was subtle and absolute. Like watching a spring under tension finally, quietly, release. Oh, he said very softly. Yeah, she said. They were 2 hours out from the squat, moving south with Olsen and Iris through the ruins toward the access point that Olsen had coordinates for when Harker found them. He came in a vehicle, an old Veth design carrier that he'd repainted in black, with 6 of his people riding the exterior and a turret on the roof that swiveled toward them before the vehicle had fully stopped. Harker himself climbed down from the cab with the unhurried confidence of a man who has been told his whole life that things arrange themselves for his convenience. He was big, heavily built, with a subdermal implant running along the left side of his skull that pulsed faintly when he was agitated. Right now it was pulsing. Dina, he said. You left without checking in. We have a thing, she said. You have a debt, he said. Which means you have obligations. Which means when I need to know where my assets are, I'm not your asset, Harker. The pulse in his skull quickened. The contract covers the debt, not us. And Cass put a limiter in Bray's systems 3 months ago, so I think we can agree the contract has some interpretation problems. A long silence. Harker looked at Bray. Bray looked back at him, and something in that look, something in the full capacity, fully restored quality of it, made Harker's eyes move in a way that might have been reassessment. The girl, Harker said, shifting his gaze to Iris. What's she worth? Nothing, Dina said. I heard different. I heard the Talos class has been spending considerable resources. Walk away, Harker. He looked at her for a long time. The turret was still tracking. His 6 people were still on the exterior of the vehicle, hands on weapons. And Bray was standing very still beside her, which was the way he stood when he had already run the scenarios and liked his numbers. Harker walked away. Not cleanly. He made a speech, first about what would happen, about long memories and debts that compounded, about the difficulty of surviving in Chicago without friends. But he walked away. Sometimes that was enough. An hour later, everything went bad at once. They were crossing the open ground of what had been a rail yard. Unavoidable, Olsen said. The access point was on the south side. when the Talos class and his people came out of the sky, not from aircraft. That was the detail that Dina's mind kept snagging on afterward. They dropped from above, not from vehicles, using Veth repulsor harnesses that slowed their descent like a leaf caught in an updraft. 4 of them, combat augmented, and then Talos himself, the commander, the one Olsen had told her about. He looked human. That was the first thing. He was tall, lean, with a stillness that read as confidence rather than malfunction, and his face still had the structure of a face. Eyes, nose, mouth, in the places faces kept those things. But the Veth augmentation ran all the way to the surface. Silver-chased subdermal lattice, visible at his jaw and temples and the backs of hands, and his eyes were wrong. Fully augment, full spectrum, Veth optical units that registered nothing like human warmth. He looked at Iris the way you look at a tool you've been searching for. "You've made this more complicated than it needed to be," he said to Olsen, conversationally. Olsen stepped in front of Iris and said nothing. "The girl will come with me," Talos said. "The rest of you can go. This isn't personal, this is logistics." "It's personal," Dina said. He looked at her. There was something in his gaze, not contempt, not quite. More like the feeling you get when you found a variable in an equation you thought was solved, and you're deciding whether it's interesting or just a nuisance. "You're Kovacs," he said. "I am. I know your file. 3 combat tours, 17 confirmed engagements against Veth field units. You survived things that the probability models said you shouldn't have." He tilted his head slightly. "I've wondered about that." "Luck," she said. "No," he said. "Not luck. Humans don't survive this war on luck. They survive it on something else. Something that my models keep failing to account for." He paused, and something moved across his face that might once have been curiosity. "It would be interesting to study. But I don't have time today." He lifted his hand and his 4 people moved. What happened in the next 90 seconds was not clean. It was not heroic. It was the kind of fighting that happens in open ground with inadequate cover. Scrambling and brutal and very loud. Bray took 2 of them, and Dina took the 3rd. And Olsen fought the 4th with an efficiency that confirmed everything she'd suspected about his training. But the combat was a distraction. It was always a distraction. She understood too late, and when she looked round for fire, she saw far Talos standing 20 meters away with the girl in his grip, not roughly but completely. And the look on Iris's face was not fear. It was something colder, resignation, the look of someone who has known for a long time that this moment was coming. Talos looked back at Dena. 2 days, he said. "It takes 2 days to reach the activation point. If you want to try and stop me, you know where I'll be." He paused. "I don't think you'll come. You studied my file," she said. "What does it say about what I do when someone tells me I won't?" He looked at her for a moment longer. Then he and his people lifted on their repulsor harnesses and rose above the rail yard and were gone. Olsen sat down on the rubble and put his head in his hands. They found Harker again 3 hours later. He found them, more accurately, came to the squat with 6 fewer men than he'd had in the rail yard and a different expression. Humbler, interested in a transaction. "The Talos class killed 3 of my people," he said. "We're apparently both on his list now." "You had the chance to walk away," Dina said. "I walked the wrong direction." He looked at the floor. "What do you need?" she told him. He was quiet for a moment then. "The exo-rig in my basement is Veth standard. Captured, modified. Nobody I have can fit the operational parameters." He looked at her. "You can. I know." "It's going to be terrible," he said, with an honesty she hadn't expected from him. "The Veth designed those rigs for physiology that's different enough that running one in a human body is. It's not comfortable." "I don't need comfortable," she said. "I need functional," he nodded slowly. For a moment he just looked at her, and she could see him doing some recalculation, reassigning her to a different category in whatever taxonomy he kept people in. "For what it's worth," he said, "the limiter wasn't my idea. It was Cass. He told me it was standard risk management." He paused. "I should have asked more questions." "Yes," she said. "You should have." They went south the next morning. The exo-rig was heavy and wrong-shaped, and the interface node at the back of her skull ached every time the system cycled a new command, which was constantly. She had worn powered armor before, in the war. Human-designed, human-fitted, built around the understanding that the person inside was an operator, not a component. The Veth rig was different. It had been built with the assumption that the operator and the machine would negotiate, and the machine was not accustomed to losing negotiations. She fought it every step. By the time they reached the district boundary, she had learned how to suggest rather than command, and the rig had learned that she wasn't going to stop. A kind of grudging accommodation. Bray moved beside her, fully restored, and she kept noticing the difference. The precision of his movement, the economy, the sense of capability held in reserve. She thought about Dakasa's adjustments, the months of diminishment that Bray had moved through, without knowing what he'd lost. The quiet damage of it. She reached out and touched his arm and he looked at her. "When this is over," she said. "Yeah," he said. "When this is over, it was enough." The access point was a maintenance shaft entrance, hidden in the sub-basement of a collapsed transit hub. A concrete throat dropping 60 meters into the earth. Into the Veth infrastructure that had been laid down during the occupation years, when the aliens had seeded the bedrock of human cities with their technology the way a farmer seeds a field. Not randomly, deliberately. With a plan for harvest, Olsen had the shaft coordinates from his mission brief. He also had Bray's scanner running ahead of them, checking for automated defense systems, of which there were several. They disabled 4 and talked their way past the 5th. Or rather, Bray interfaced with it directly, his Veth origin augments generating a handshake protocol that the system recognized as belonging, which was a strange and useful kind of camouflage. Being partly alien had its applications. The shaft bottom opened into a space that Dina had no framework for. It was huge. That was the first and only word that came to her. The word that sat in front of all the other words, and wouldn't move. Huge in the way that geological formations are huge. In the way that reminds you that the world doesn't require your presence or your categories. The Veth infrastructure chamber stretched in all directions, and in it, crouched in the darkness like something sleeping off a long patience, was the machine. She had heard it described. She had tried to image it. The description and the image were not useful. It was multi-legged, which was the most human thing she could say about it. Beyond that, it was Veth in a way that her visual processing struggled to organize. Asymmetric in a patterned way. Articulated in joints that didn't match any vertebrate template, surfaced in material that seemed to absorb light, and then release it slightly altered. It was the size of a city block. It was sleeping, and the sleeping had a sound, a deep subsonic vibration that she felt in the back of her teeth and of her spine. Talos was already there. He stood on a raised platform at the machine's forward interface node, and he had Iris standing beside him, and his hand was on the girl's shoulder in a way that looked protective and wasn't. Around the platform, his 4 augmented operatives stood at their positions, and off to the side, partially concealed by a structural support column, was the hybrid, the woman, fully augmented, Veth smooth and silent in the way that things are silent when they've stopped making the small human sounds they were born making. Her name, Olsen had said, was Nyx, and she had been assigned to kill anyone who came too far into the chamber. Dina stopped and looked at the layout. She looked at the distances. She looked at the columns and the sight lines and the machine's leg joints, which were large enough to provide cover, and also very probably automated defense nodes. Then she looked at Bray. He was looking at Nyx. "I've got her," he said. "She's fully augmented, Veth spec combat class." "I know," he paused. "So am I." She wanted to say something. There were things she needed to say that she'd been carrying for 2 years, and had never found the right threshold for. And this might be the last threshold there was. She looked at his face. The parts of it that were still his face. The eyes that were now augmented but still held him behind them. Still recognizably the person who had been there before the war, decided to take most of him apart. "Don't die," she said. He almost smiled, almost. "Working on it." He peeled off to the left, moving toward Nyx in the shadow of the machine's legs, and Denna came up the center. And Harker and his people fanned out on the flanks, and Olsen covered the entrance, and Talos saw all of it and didn't move. "I told you not to come," he said. "I know," she said. "I told you because I was giving you an honest assessment of the probability of success, not a challenge." "I know," she said again. "You understand that the machine is already in pre-activation sequence. Iris has provided the first stage biometric authorization. The sequence takes 11 minutes to complete. You have." He glanced at a display she couldn't see. 9 and 30 seconds. "So let's not waste them." She moved. The combat in the chamber was not like the combat in the rail yard. The rail yard had been a scramble, chaotic, no control over the geometry. The chamber had geometry, massive and strange and Veth built, but geometry nonetheless. And Dina had spent 15 years learning how to fight in spaces by learning their geometry the way a dancer learns a stage. She used the machine's leg joints for cover and moved between them while Harker's people drew the attention of Talos's operatives, and the exo-rig howled around her as she asked it for speeds it had been designed to deliver and hadn't expected to be asked for. She reached the platform with 4 minutes left on Olsen's internal clock. Talos met her there without weapons. That was a statement. He wasn't reaching for a weapon because he didn't consider her a weapons-level threat, and she had enough combat experience to recognize the insult in it. He was right, technically. The exo-rig had taken significant damage from 2 of his operatives. Her left arm was locked at 90 degrees, the shoulder joint compromised, and the interface node at her skull was cycling error messages that she was deliberately not reading. On paper, she was not a weapons-level threat. She hit him with the right arm, the one that still worked, and the force of an exo-rig at full extension with her entire body behind it was not a gentle thing. It took him off his feet. He came back up fast, the vet augments absorbing what would have broken an unmodified human, and she hit him again, and he hit her, and the rig absorbed that too, and they were in the kind of fight where neither party is winning cleanly, and the question is just who runs out of something first. He was bigger, he was faster, he was on metrics superior, but he kept making the same mistake. He kept trying to understand her. She'd seen it in the rail yard. The pause before he'd left, the comment about her file, the reference to probability models that failed to account for something. He was fascinated by it. The survival rate that didn't match. The stubbornness that didn't compute. Every time she did something he hadn't predicted, she could see it in his augmented eyes. Not fear, but recalculation, the constant running of a model against a data point that wouldn't fit. She understood, in the middle of the 4th exchange, what the difference was. He was optimizing. That was what the Veth had done to him, what the augments and the ideology and the long solitude of his Messiah complex had done. Turned him into a system running the best possible response to every input. Smooth, efficient, correct. She wasn't optimizing, she was just angry. There was no model for that. There was no probability distribution for the specific flavor of human fury that comes from 2 years of debt and damaged partners. And a city that smelled like something else's chemistry. And a girl with engineered eyes who looked at the world like it had already taken everything it was going to take from her. The fury that had its roots in a map with too much red on it and a word, Olympus, that you couldn't want too badly because the wanting hurt. She hit him 11 times. The 4th through 11th without the rig, because the rig had finally given up on her. The exoskeleton locking down in a system failure that left her standing in it like a statue, and she had to strip out of it in a process that cost her skin off both forearms. She hit him with her bare hands, which was absurd, which was the kind of thing that shouldn't have worked. Talos went down on the 3rd hit from her bare hands, not because the hits were stronger than the rig's. They weren't, by orders of magnitude, but because every time she hit him, he ran the probability update, and the probability update kept returning the same unacceptable answer, and somewhere in the recursive loop of that, he stopped compensating for the next one. She stood over him and breathed. 2 minutes, Olsen called from below. His voice was strange. She looked over the edge of the platform and saw him on his knees beside the interface node, with Iris standing before it, the girl's eyes open and luminous in the machine's pre-activation glow. Iris, Dina called. The girl looked up at her. You don't have to do this, Dina said. Yes, I do, Iris said. It wasn't resignation anymore. It was something else. Something that had worked itself all the way through to the other side of resignation and come out somewhere Dina didn't have a name for. I was made for this. That bothered me for a long time. It doesn't anymore. She paused. There are things that are worth being made for. She turned back to the interface. Nix died somewhere in the machine's lower levels, in a fight that Dina wasn't there for and that Bray never described in detail. She knew it had happened because he came up the platform stairs with his right arm hanging wrong in blood, the human part of it, running freely from a wound above his eye. He came up the stairs anyway. He always came up the stairs. He stood beside her, and they watched Iris complete the interface, and the machine around them began a sound that was not the pre-activation vibration. Lower, longer, the sound of something very large committing to a decision. How long, Bray said. 4 minutes, Olsen said, from the floor, not moving. His voice had taken on the quality of something already decided. Dina looked at him. He looked back. His mission brief, she understood then, had not been one way. Olsen, she said. Get the girl out, he said. That's all I need. Harker got them out. 6 of his people, 2 of his own body weight, and an instinct for emergency exits that came from years of operating in spaces where you needed to know where the doors were. He knew where the door was. They ran. The detonation was subsurface, and so the sound was wrong. Not the crack of a surface explosion, but a deep geological shudder. The kind that travels up through your feet and your shins and your chest before your ears register it. The ground moved, then it settled, then it was quiet. They stood in the rail yard. The same rail yard, it turned out, where everything had started going bad, and looked at the smoke that was finding its way up, through cracks in the earth 2 blocks south. Iris stood apart from the group, her face turned toward it. Harker's people sat on the rubble and didn't talk. Bray was next to Dina, his damaged arm held close to his side, and she was looking at the smoke, and not thinking about Olsen. Not yet, putting that away for later when she could think about it properly. Olympus will send someone, Iris said. She was still looking at the smoke. They'll come for me. They'll offer to take you too, Dina waited. You should go, Iris said. Probably, Dina said. A long silence, wind in the broken buildings, the city making its constant sounds of slow collapse. But not today, Dina said. Iris turned and looked at her. The luminescence in her eyes was dimmer now, spent, or resting, or just quieter without the machine awake below them. She looked younger. She looked like someone who had just put down something very heavy and wasn't sure yet what to do with her hands. Why not today, she said. Dina thought about the map with too much red on it. She thought about the supply cache stacking structure, and the debt that was gone now, and the squat on the 14th floor, with the wind coming through. She thought about the word Olympus and the specific discipline required not to want it too badly. Because someone has to be here, she said. Someone has to know the streets. Harker, sitting on a piece of rubble 10 feet away, made a sound that might have been a laugh. He covered it with a cough. Bray said nothing, but she felt him shift his weight slightly, that almost imperceptible redistribution. That was the way he said yes without words, and that was enough. That was more than enough. Iris nodded slowly. She sat down on the rubble next to Dina and looked out at the city, at the broken spires and the red-mapped distances, and the smoke still threaching up from 2 blocks south like a slow exhalation, like the ground itself finally breathing out. Tell me about the streets, she said, and Dina told her. The city smelled like rust and old fire, and underneath it, for the first time in 3 years, something else, faint barely there, the kind of smell that precedes things rather than following them. She couldn't name it. It wasn't clean air. It wasn't quite hope. It was the particular smell of something that was still in the process of being decided. She kept talking.